September 11th, 2001. A day remembered for the worst terrorist atrocity in living memory. Hijackers fly planes into the World Trade Center towers. Before the day was over, two questions would ring out around the world. Who was responsible, and why did these two huge buildings collapse the way they did? The first question has long been solved, but the second refuses to go away. Built to survive a direct impact by an airliner, could office fires really cause two of the world's most sophisticated buildings to collapse?
I'm just shocked, horrified. I say to myself, how could this happen?
The official report into the collapse leaves many unsatisfied. The question has spawned 1,000 conspiracy theories.
Many architects and engineers, technical and building professionals have found evidence for explosive controlled demolition.
Now, a new theory developed independently by two scientists on either side of the Atlantic discovers missing evidence that could signal the end to the conspiracy theories. An explanation found not in the fabric of the towers, but in the airplanes themselves.
There was a bomb in the building, and it was just a matter of time before the whole thing blew up and down come the towers.
Built in the early 1970s, at the time the Twin Towers were the tallest buildings in the world. Brash, bold, and iconic, they were a marvel of design and architecture, a symbol of America's global power. But the revolutionary structures were about more than just their looks. Constructed from 200,000 tons of reinforced steel, they were built to withstand hurricanes and even a collision from a 707 jet. Yet, within 2 hours of the terrorist attack, both had collapsed. Today, all that remains of the Twin Towers, the most famous buildings that once stood in New York, are two giant footprints. Of the 2,700 victims named here, most died not when the planes hit the buildings, but as the towers collapsed. For many New Yorkers, the Freedom Tower acts as a symbol of resilience for a city that lost so much. And for Bobby McGuire, a firefighter from Long Island, it has a very special significance.
You know, out of the 343 firefighters we lost, I lost many, many friends, and I lost my nephew. He was a probie, which means less than a year on a job, and it was his very first fire. His unit was one of the first to respond, and he was in the North Tower when it collapsed. I gotta think he was pretty high up.
Bobby arrived on the scene just as the second tower was coming down.
It was complete chaos. And then you had thousands and thousands of people running for their lives in every direction, not really knowing where to go. Reports of more planes coming in added to the confusion. I've never seen a building collapse like that before, no. It was like a pancake effect that I don't remember having any type of building, certainly nothing that size, collapse.
The 110-story World Trade Center towers were designed to withstand the impact of a commercial jetliner. Yet within 2 hours of the attacks, both collapse. So why did the Twin Towers fail so disastrously and so quickly? Under public pressure, the U.S. government commissions a $16 million investigation from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, in an attempt to explain the structural failures of the towers. They examine the debris from the disaster, run hundreds of computer simulations, and conduct extensive lab tests. In October of 2005, they published their conclusions. According to the report, the buildings collapsed because when the aircrafts hit, the impact dislodged the fireproofing around the building's structural steel skeleton. Unprotected from the fires, the steel frame weakened and the towers collapsed.
We say here the buildings would not have collapsed under the effects of the airplane impact and the jet fuel ignited multi-floor fires. The reason it collapsed is because the fireproofing was dislodged.
But the NIST report is restricted to finding an explanation for the collapse of the steel supports on the impact floors alone. It does not deal with the subsequent disintegration of the towers. And the dramatic nature of their collapse becomes an obsession for online conspiracy websites. One of the most prominent and controversial conspiracy sites is Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Its founder is Richard Gage.
We now have 2,200 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation of what happened at the World Trade Center complex on 9/11.
Despite Gage's opinions being offensive to many, he's attempting to gain mainstream acceptability with a combination of pseudoscience and conjecture to exploit what many see as a major shortcoming in the official report.
The official report does not account for the hundreds of eyewitness testimony of explosions.
There was a heavy-duty explosion.
It was the third explosion. The whole lobby collapsed on us.
In all, over 118 New York firefighters claimed they heard explosions just before the collapse of both towers. Yet their testimony is not addressed in the official report.
This explosive testimony that was not released until August of 2005. It was being held by the city, but the New York Court State of Appeals forced the overturning.
For Gage, the withholding of this testimony is no oversight. It's part of a cover-up. He claims that the explosions are evidence that before the airplanes were flown into the towers, bombs were planted inside, guaranteeing their collapse.
So many architects and engineers, technical and building professionals, have found evidence for explosive-controlled demolition.
For these conspiracy theorists, only controlled demolitions could have brought down the towers in the manner we see.
What we have in the World Trade Centers is massive explosions, recorded by first responders, traveling down the sides of the building, completely destroying the structural steel frame in 12 seconds.
Gage's claims are highly implausible. After the terrorist attack in 1993, the World Trade Center towers were among the most secure in New York. If Gage was right, explosives would have had to be smuggled into both towers and their detonation precisely coordinated. For many of those directly affected by the disaster, claims of government involvement are deeply offensive.
We've all heard the conspiracy theories, and be honest with you, I don't know of one single firefighter that puts any heat into that. I kind of think anyone that thinks our own government would do that is kind of out there somewhere. I certainly don't believe it. I think we all know who did this and why.
For Dr. Frank Greening, a nuclear research chemist of over 20 years, the question of government conspiracy was never an option. But there were still many aspects of the official inquiry that troubled him. And until they were explained completely, there would always be fertile ground for conspiracy theories. What Greening discovered was so remarkable, it not only answered the outlandish claims of the theorists, it would change our understanding of the disaster forever. The official government report into the Twin Towers tragedy only tackled events on the initial impact floors, not the physics behind the subsequent collapse. It left the field wide open for conspiracy theorists who point to the unexpectedly rapid collapse amid reports of explosions. Nuclear chemist Dr. Frank Greening was also surprised that the towers collapsed so quickly.
I watched this whole thing unfold like everybody did. And then, of course, the South Tower collapses. The top section just crushes the lower section. A little later, the North Tower does the same thing, and I'm just shocked, horrified. And I say to myself, how could this happen?
Greening felt that until the mechanics of the collapse were properly understood, the fanatical rumors would simply not go away. He decided to calculate whether the towers would collapse under their own weight, without the need for explosives.
The first thing I felt needed to be cleared up was, could the building collapse the way we saw it, or did it actually need help from explosives, as some people were suggesting? I really threw myself into 9/11 research, and I decided I wanted to apply science, physics to studying this problem. I set up a computer program based on momentum transfer to look at each impact of each floor.
Greening's momentum transfer program calculated the weight of the buildings above the impact floors. He discovered that if one floor failed, the weight of the higher floors would cause each floor below to give way exactly as seen. As the impacts were on different floors, the simulation would need to account for the differing mass above each. There were 15 floors above the impact point in the North Tower, and 22 floors above the South Tower. Frank's calculations would also need to prove that the floors below each impact point would disintegrate in a manner that looks similar to a controlled demolition.
I ran the program, and it showed that the buildings would indeed come down. Even more interesting was the computer program predicted the collapse times.
The North Tower falls in 13 seconds, but with a greater number of floors above the impact site of the South Tower, it takes only 11 seconds.
Once the building started to collapse, there was no stopping it. It was a juggernaut. The mass of the upper block in the North Tower is equivalent to the mass of the Titanic. It's about 38,000 tons.
In 2008, Frank's work is published in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. It dismisses the idea of controlled explosions, but his investigation leads him to question fundamental aspects of the official report.
Towers were burning away furiously. Then the fires subsided somewhat, and then suddenly out of the blue, the North Tower and the South Tower just collapsed. The question is why? What started that?
Although he has dispelled the conspiracy theorists' ideas about controlled demolition, there is still the nagging question about the explosions heard by firefighters before the collapse. But central to his concern was the conclusion that the office fires were capable of weakening sufficient numbers of the structural steel girders to trigger collapse. Around the world, super tall skyscrapers dominate our skyline. The pinnacle of design and engineering, these towers are built to last. And just like the Twin Towers, the key to their strength is that they are constructed around a strong steel skeleton. Structural engineer Roma Agrawal helped build Europe's tallest skyscraper, London's Shard.
The Twin Towers had two tubes, one inside the other, to form the structure. The inner tube was called the core, and it had vertical steel columns in it. The outer tube also had vertical steel columns in it, and the horizontal beams going around the building formed a lattice with those columns to keep it stable.
This tube lattice design meant that the towers initially stood firm,
When the building was impacted by the plane, a number of the columns and the beams were severed. But because of this tube lattice system, the weight of the building could actually find a different way to go around the hole. So the impact by itself would not necessarily have caused the tower to collapse.
By redistributing the loads of the higher floors around the damaged structures, the buildings survived the plane's initial impacts. But they do collapse, one after 56 minutes, the other after 103 minutes. Something caused the surviving structural steel columns to fail.
The official report explained that the temperatures of the fires were high enough to cause the steel to lose its strength and to compromise its integrity. And this is what ultimately brought the buildings down.
No skyscraper has ever collapsed due to fire prior to 9/11.
9/11 Truth Movement founder Richard Gage doesn't believe the fires could have weakened the steel structure.
The exterior perimeter structure of these towers was massive, as was the core. 47 columns, 52 inches by 22 inches. It's solid steel. There's no evidence for temperatures reaching the structural steel that could even cause the weakening of that steel.
For the skeptics, it was the fires were not that intense. They were kind of patchy at best, and they argued that insufficient heat was being supplied to the columns, and therefore there was no way a fire could weaken the steel.
Steel has been used in the construction industry for over a century. Without it, high-rise buildings that dominate our cities would not have been possible. A man-made alloy of iron and carbon, steel offers unrivaled strength and flexibility. Manufactured to be fire-resistant, steel retains its strength in high temperatures for extended periods of time. And around the world, high-rise steel buildings have remained standing despite the most intense fire damage. So why did the steel frame of the Twin Towers fail? The 9/11 hijackers chose long-distance flights because they knew the fuel loads inside the jets were at a maximum, around 10,000 gallons. Yet most of the fuel burned off within seconds, and all within a few minutes. After that, the fires that spread over several floors were sustained by the contents of the offices.
There was a lot of what engineers call fire load in the building. So materials like wood, which may have been in the flooring, the furniture and so on, provide a lot of fuel to these fires. So even after the jet fuel may have burnt out, there's lots of other stuff that can cause the fire to burn.
But were the fires hot enough to significantly weaken the steel in just the short time it took the towers to collapse? The question is one of complex thermodynamics.
The official report explains that once the steel gets to above about 600 degrees centigrade, which is over 1,000 Fahrenheit, that it starts to lose a significant proportion of its strength. The key question is, how long does it take? So the fires might get there very, very quickly, but the steel might take a bit longer, and there's a bit of a time lag from one to the other. That time lag depends on how much protection there is on the steel.
The important steel girders inside the tower were treated with a spray-on heat-retardant concrete that would certainly have protected the steel from the fires. NIST, the organization carrying out the official investigation, recreated the conditions inside the burning buildings to check what impact the fires would have had on the protected steel. The results were surprising.
As part of the official investigation, a number of experiments were done to understand how quickly steel gets to that critical temperature where it loses a lot of its strength. And this was done when the steel was protected with this sprayed-on insulation, and it took over 10 hours.
Yet within 2 hours, both towers had collapsed, long before they should have. To explain the discrepancy, NIST removed the fire protection and repeated the tests.
When the same experiment was done without any protection on the steel at all, it took a mere 13 minutes.
The conclusion drawn by the NIST report lies at the heart of the debate. They concluded that because the steel girders gave way, substantial numbers must have lost their fireproofing. But how? The report assumed that fireproofing had been knocked off by the initial impact from the aircraft. The conclusion of the entire official report hinges on this critical assumption. Without it, there is simply no way of explaining how the steel structures gave way.
The findings of the official report really rest on the question of whether the steel was protected or not, and whether that fire protection had been dislodged or not as a result of the impacts.
There are many respected industry experts, including the Structural Fire Group in one of the world's largest engineering firms and professor of fire protection engineering at the University of Maryland, who do not believe that the fireproofing could have been dislodged, throwing the conclusions of the report into serious doubt. If the fireproofing was not dislodged, the NIST report offers no other explanation for the event that triggered the collapse and caused the deaths of so many people. Nuclear chemist Dr. Frank Greening scours the 10,000-page report, looking for clues that might suggest an alternative answer, when one passage catches his attention. According to the report, just 7 minutes before the South Tower fell, there were signs of explosive activity within the tower as a glowing liquid began to pour from one of the impact floors. The liquid can clearly be seen on this video footage.
One of the most interesting clips that people discuss at great length concerning the World Trade Center collapse is this footage of the South Tower, and just before the collapse, we see a golden stream of what looks like a molten metal pouring from one of the windows.
The official report concluded the molten metal played no part in the collapse. But to Frank Greening, the cascade was extremely significant. It was the missing evidence he'd been searching for.
I came with a chemist's perspective. I see the chemistry as the key, and I think that's what is probably the probable reason why NIST failed to consider the role of chemistry. Basically, they're not chemists.
Frank suspects that the metal seen pouring from the window is a material with a far lower melting point than steel, a metal present in huge quantities on the burning floor, and a metal extensively used in the manufacture of aircraft: aluminum. And to Frank's disbelief, he finds that aluminum aircraft parts formed no part of the official investigation's extensive fire tests.
They did great tests for an office fire, and that's a huge omission in their work, and I feel until those tests are repeated with an aircraft included in the office, their results are essentially meaningless.
Could the presence of aluminum have provided the trigger that led to the initial collapse of the buildings? Frank shares his concerns in a research paper online. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another scientist spots the same oversight in the official report. Christian Simonsen is a senior metallurgist at SINTEF, one of Europe's largest independent research laboratories specializing in material science. He's one of the world's foremost experts in metals, and he has also published a paper in the Journal of Engineering that mirrored Frank's concern over the short time it took for the steel structures to give way.
When I read that, 300 pages, it only had a theory about the building and how the building were overheated and that it started to crumple. I didn't believe that for 1 minute, because 1 hour is not long enough for the steel to heat up. It takes much longer time.
Working independently, both scientists arrive at the same conclusion.
The official report was concentrating on the steel bars, but the missing element is the aircraft.
And the missing evidence, quite simply, is that there was a huge aircraft sitting inside the building.
The official report assumes the aircraft disintegrated on impact and the debris scattered harmlessly across several floors. so the aircraft wreckage was not included in any fire tests. This omission is also questioned by experts from the aviation industry.
I think it is a little surprising that they did not include anything from the aircraft in their estimates of the fire behaviour.
Dr. Guy Grattan is an aeronautical engineer. Having studied the official report, he rejects the idea that the planes disintegrated.
When the aeroplane flew into the tower, it would have hit the metal and concrete structure of the tower, would have broken up into smaller pieces, which would have come into rest.
Grattan believes that during the impact, as the planes sliced through the steel columns, substantial chunks of metal would have come to rest in the very center of the building. By excluding the aircraft from its calculations, the official report has overlooked potentially crucial evidence. If the temperature inside the burning buildings got hot enough to melt the wreckage, the results would almost certainly have been catastrophic. And that's because, under the right conditions, molten aluminum can be one of the most explosive substances in the world. Working on either side of the Atlantic, two renowned scientists, Frank Greening and Christian Simonsen, are challenging the official 9/11 report into the collapse of the Twin Towers. They believe that by ignoring the presence of aircraft wreckage in the fires, the report is incomplete. The presence of aircraft debris in the fires could provide a solution to the many outstanding questions over the disaster. Like why so many people heard explosions prior to the collapse.
When I read about the aircraft, it was made by 30-ton aluminium, something of the same order with steel, and then some carbonite and so on, all kind of materials. And the most important part of these materials were aluminium.
Aluminum is the most abundant metal on the planet. Softer, lighter, and more flexible than iron and steel, it's the ideal material for building aircraft.
Back in the early days of commercial aviation, aircraft were manufactured from wood. By World War II, they started to pressurize aircraft and also carry a lot more payload. Wood just wasn't up to it. And aluminium and steel, particularly aluminium alloys, became the main materials that we used. For the larger aircraft structures, the fuselage, the wings, what you need is the ability to make very large, very lightweight, complex shapes. So that's why aluminium alloys are primarily used for those parts of an aeroplane. This is a typical aluminium aircraft structure. So you've got this skin a few millimeters thick. That takes the pressure difference at altitude. It also takes the bending and the basic load of all of this structure that's in here.
Under normal conditions, this incredibly flexible and versatile metal is entirely safe, but in extreme circumstances, aluminum can become incredibly volatile. Christian is on his way to an aluminum recycling plant near Oslo, and aluminum plants have long been aware of the extreme dangers of the metal.
After the early 1970s, with a few accidents with aluminium, people became aware of how dangerous aluminium can be under certain circumstances.
One of those circumstances is when the metal is molten, and workers at this plant know the dangers firsthand.
We have had one explosion 15 years ago, which was quite severe. Luckily, nobody was hurt or injured.
Molten aluminum is safe until it comes into contact with one of the most common molecules on the planet, causing a highly explosive exothermic reaction. That abundant substance is water. When water comes into contact with molten aluminum, the water molecules recombine, producing aluminum oxide and hydrogen, releasing an explosive amount of energy.
If you have a closed container containing water coming together with liquid aluminium in your furnace, you can have a severe explosion.
In 2007, this aluminum factory in Manchester, Georgia, was partly demolished when water seeped into the casting process.
It's very, very apparent that moisture got in.
Just a loud boom, and we had no idea what it was.
I mean, I've never heard anything like it in my life, and hope I never hear it again.
Explosions like these are far from isolated.
If you're a metallurgist who is dealing with aluminium, you know that there have taken place 250 explosions in aluminium cast house since 1980.
The worst explosion is probably the one in Shandong in 2007, where 16 people were killed, 61 people were injured, and there was nothing left of the factory.
Pound for pound, molten aluminum is 3 times more powerful than TNT. Each one of these ingots contains the same potential explosive energy as 50 pounds of dynamite. Frank and Christian believe that the explosive properties of molten aluminum are directly responsible for the rapid collapse of the Twin Towers.
The weight of the aircrafts were about 100 tons. 30 tons of that were of aluminium, and those were situated all over the aircraft. They were on the outside, they were inside the wings, they were everywhere. You had some parts which were made of aluminium.
Their new theory states that after the impacts, anything up to 30 tons of aluminum lay in the middle of the burning floors of the towers. And once it became molten, it had the potential explosive force of 90 tons of TNT.
Behind that wall there is the fuselage of a large Boeing 767, which contains about 30 tons of aluminum. And I believe it started to melt and it's pouring out of the building.
If they're right, the molten aluminum inside the building provided the explosive force that brought down the towers.
There was a bomb in the building, but it was not man-made. It was made by the combination of all the ingredients that were being cooked up, and it was just a matter of time before the whole thing blew up and down come the towers.
The theory could explain several of the questions unanswered by the official report, including the explosions heard by 118 firemen. If enough aluminum reacted in a single event, it would provide enough force to damage the steel supports sufficiently to weaken them, with or without fireproofing. The fires in the building were certainly hot enough to melt the aluminum. According to the official report, 15 minutes after impact, around 40% of the fire had reached temperatures of over 700 degrees.
The main alloy used in the Boeing 767 was 2024. It's got a melting point of around 550 degrees centigrade, slightly lower than pure aluminium.
But the showering metal in the footage is glowing bright yellow, and aluminum only reaches that color if it's heated to well over 1,000 degrees centigrade.
So I started to question, well, could it get hot enough to glow yellow? We need really hot aluminum to be convinced that this really is aluminum.
The question is critical. Unless the temperature inside the towers were high enough, Frank's theory could fall apart. Metallurgist Christian believes that the temperature inside the tower could have reached those inside this smelter.
My experience with aluminium smelters, with molten metal and burners, that is very close to what's happening in the Twin Towers.
Inside this smelter, it takes 30 minutes to melt 50 tons of aluminum. That's because the furnace is perfectly engineered to intensify the temperature.
In this furnace here is one burner which is heating up the aluminium, and it's surrounded by insulation material.
Christian believes that the building rubble inside the towers acted as insulation, recreating similar conditions to this furnace, accelerating temperatures to 1,000 degrees.
It's very very similar to the situation in New York. You have burners in the center with all the aluminium from the aircraft, and around it is about 10 centimeters insulation material, which is the building material.
The official report appears to support his theory, showing that in specific areas, the temperatures reached a surprising 900 degrees. Christian's theory is that after crashing into the tower, the aircraft wreckage came to rest in the center of the building. On the way, the plane collected building rubble, in particular, the gypsum plasterboard that formed the internal walls and paneling. The plasterboard rubble acted like the insulating walls in the industrial smelter, heating the aluminum sufficiently to create the bright yellow molten metal seen pouring down the building. And if the molten aluminum was cascading down the side of the building, it would also be seeping through the fractures in the damaged floor below. The only ingredient needed now was water. But was there enough water in the Twin Towers to react with the molten aluminum to cause two catastrophic explosions? Nuclear chemist Frank Greening and metallurgist Christian Simonsen believe they have found the answer to some of the questions left unexplained by the official report into the collapse of the Twin Towers. They suspect NIST may have missed the true cause of the collapse, one of the most potentially explosive metals on Earth, aluminum. But molten aluminum won't explode without water, and Christian believes that in the floors below the fires, there was water in abundance.
They had sprinkler device in every room, so the sprinkler device will come into action because there has been nothing wrong in those rooms.
Spread throughout each tower were 30,000 gallons of water. In the event of fire, the sprinkler system was designed to pump hundreds of gallons onto the burning floors. Could it be that the system designed to prevent disaster was the very thing that destroyed the towers? According to the official report, the sprinkler systems on the crashed floors were damaged by the aircraft impacts. However, eyewitness reports confirm that on the floors below, the system was pumping out gallons of water. And as Frank points out, the sprinkler system wasn't the only available source of water.
There's the water to washrooms, kitchenettes, there's water bottles, there's Coke machines, all being smashed. There was plenty of water.
But water isn't the only danger. There are other substances that contain the components of water, oxygen and hydrogen, that will also react with molten aluminum. Among them are lime, iron oxide, and gypsum. All were present in substantial quantities inside the towers.
Those are precisely the elements that are present in the World Trade Center. The gypsum is gyprock, wallboard, plasterboard. That was all over the building. There's iron oxide on the steel beams. Then you have concrete in abundance.
Both towers were packed with multiple reactants, all or any one of which could potentially trigger the largest molten aluminum explosion in history. Christian and Frank believe this answers why and how the towers collapsed. Their theory could explain the molten metal pouring from the building, as well as the explosions heard by witnesses in the moments before the towers collapsed. The theory goes like this. On impact, the steel frame of the towers cut the aircraft into large sections. Inside the burning floors, the building debris collects to form an insulating wall around the aircraft wreckage, creating a furnace. Inside, the aluminum reaches 1,000 degrees. At 700 degrees above its melting point, the aluminum now flows like water. Finding cracks and holes in the damaged floor, the molten metal lands in pools of water from the sprinkler system on the floor below.
Molten aluminium will react with the water underneath and you get a huge explosion.
Like a bomb going off. At that point, the collapse is inevitable.
Did the firefighters actually hear a series of aluminum explosions inside the towers? Were those explosions large enough to cause the building to collapse so unexpectedly? Frank and Christian need physical evidence if they are to prove their theory, and that is lying in the remaining rubble of the Twin Towers. Up until now, Frank and Christian have collaborated long distance. Now at a memorial for the firefighters who lost their lives on 9/11, they meet for the first time.
The view is beautiful.
It sure is. That's someone who would be about my age. I was born in 1947.
Marianne Simon, Jennifer Lynn, Stephen Gerard Siller.
To me, the amazing thing about what happened in the collapse of the Twin Towers was you had all these ingredients that were thrown together that had a terrible consequence. You had aluminum that became molten, you had water, and then you had the catalysts, you had iron oxide, you had gypsum, you had crushed concrete. Those are the key ingredients for a terrible explosion.
Proof for their claims can only lie in the remaining rubble of the collapsed towers. But the majority of the debris was put into landfill. What remains is now in the possession of the New York Port Authority. If there was an aluminum explosion, then the debris will contain the telltale droplets of exploded aluminum oxide. Missing Evidence approached the Port Authority with a request to search for the alloy, but the authority refused access to any material from the site. Someday, Frank and Christian hope to fully test their theory, but until the Port Authority gives access to the remaining debris, the truth may never be known. Missing Evidence also approached NIST, the body responsible for the official report, to comment on Frank and Christian's theory. NIST stood by their claims that the aircraft had disintegrated on impact. Any molten aluminum, they said, would have flowed downward and quickly re-solidified. At the time of the collapse, no liquid aluminum would have been available to react with water. Frank is disappointed with NIST's response. Video evidence clearly shows a molten metal pouring from the South Tower moments before the collapse.
Just behind this stream in the building is the aircraft. And it's sitting right in the fire, which is extremely hot, and there's certainly enough heat to melt the aluminum.
NIST's response contradicts the visual evidence and the conclusions of their own report. In a crucial paragraph, they state that the likely source of the molten metal seen in the 7 minutes before the collapse was aluminum from the aircraft.
I agree with NIST that this is most probably molten aluminum. What's interesting is that NIST just say, there it is, and see no further significance. I say this is extremely significant.
Frank believes that the failure to investigate the role of molten aluminum in the collapse of both towers is a critical failure of the report, one which has opened the door to outlandish conspiracy theories. Only the presence of aluminum explains the multiple explosions heard before the towers collapsed.
There was a heavy-duty explosion.
The third explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
This guy's still trapped. We couldn't get to him.
Until samples of the aircraft are identified and analyzed, Frank and Christian believe that the conspiracy theorists will never go away.
There's 60 tons of aircraft missing. Without that, you're never going to reach a definitive answer as to what caused those towers to collapse.
Those who lost friends and family deserve to know what really happened.
Out of the 343 firefighters we lost, over 40 of them were personal friends, and one was my nephew. I think if they did have an inquiry regarding what really happened and what caused the collapse, I think it would be great, especially if it would shut up these imbeciles that believe in a conspiracy theory.
In science, there's a very useful principle called Occam's razor, which says that in developing a theory, keep it simple. I believe that in the case of the World Trade Center, we had molten aluminum, we had a fire, we had everything you need to create a terrible explosion and bring down the buildings. That's the simplest solution, and I believe it's the correct solution. You will never sort out what happened until you include molten aluminum in your analysis.